Hey guys, once again. Well, one of the subjects that's been featured on this channel a lot over the years that I've been on has been quadrajet videos. And I've got a lot of good feedback and a lot of response and a lot of views from those videos, so that tells me that there continues to be a demand for information on these carburetors. And so I'm very glad once again to come back with you and explore another subject on these quadrajets, and it's one that seems to be quite popular based on the emails and the PMs and comments and questions that I get on this. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about what to do when you have a Rochester quadrajet carburetor that either runs too rich or it floods. Now, normally, as I've mentioned various times before, these carburetors operate very well. They run very well when they're tuned, and they generally just don't act up. And I've always reminded people also, if you have a carburetor problem or something you suspect is a carburetor problem, that you need to make sure that your ignition timing is correct, because on one of these older V8 or possibly V6 engines, your ignition timing being off can cause some idle problems and some running problems. So we're not going to get into that on this video, but you need to always check that as a baseline test. But what we want to talk about is we want to talk about what to do when, like I said, you have a quadrajet that's just not running right, or it's really just out and out flooding. So let's get into that. Normally your carburetor runs well, but occasionally you'll have instances where you have the engine running and it's putting out black smoke and it's kind of loping, which means the idle speed or the running speed is not even, and you go back to the exhaust and the exhaust is just so thick it's just burning your eyes. Your nose runs, your eyes water, and that's what's called rich. It's running rich. That means that you have normally any kind of internal combustion engine has a specific air to fuel mixture ratio. It's about 14.7 to 1, I believe. And so the carburetor is designed to provide the correct mixture of air from the atmosphere and fuel, which is contained in the carburetor. It's supplied through the fuel line. So that's what the job of this carburetor is. So it makes the engine run and produce the most power and hopefully fairly clean emissions. So normally the engine runs well, so when you have a problem that something's causing a problem with it. So that's what we would call rich running. You have thick black exhaust, and maybe kind of hard to start, and the exhaust is burning your eyes, things like that. So there's a couple reasons for that to happen, and one of the reasons we're going to look at is also would be cause a flooding issue, but we'll get into that in a minute. So first thing I do, if I ever have a quadrajet on an engine, if I ever have a car that has one of those, or a truck, and it's just not running right, it's idling too rich, it's loping, it's putting out black smoke, the first thing I always check is to make sure that the automatic choke is functioning, or if it's been hacked, which means somebody's come in here and didn't understand how to work this thing and adjust it and repair it, that at least it's open at all times. I don't suggest doing that. I suggest fixing it the right way, as I've showed in my other videos. But what you want to look at first, you want to pull the air cleaner off of it, and you're going to be looking at this view here. This is the top of the carburetor, and this is called the choke plate right here. This is kind of it's not really, well, I guess you could say it's spring loaded by the linkages connected to it, but it's just a plate that's mounted with two screws to kind of a pivot here, I guess you could call, for lack of a better word. Look at that there. And this thing is free to move, and at the one range of its travel, it's closed up. It closes. This is the primary venturi of the carburetor. This is the primary side, which means this is where the engine intakes its air most of the time. Sucks air in as it's running, And then of course back here you have your secondaries, these huge secondaries. But these only kick in when you really punch the gas to make it kind of simple for you. So we don't worry about that when we're talking about the choke. It has nothing to do with it. We're just simply talking about this area here, and this is the choke plate. I've heard it called different things, but it's called a choke plate. And as I said, on one range of its travel, it's closed like this, and then it can open up where it's vertical. So what do we see when we see that? When it's closed, it's blocking off the airflow into the engine. When it's vertical, there's no obstruction, so the engine gets plenty of air. So this is how the choke functions. It's got a controller, as you may, if you want to be a little bit technical about it. This is called a choke housing, and normally it would have a choke unit in here which reacts to some source of heat, and then it's got a spring-loaded, normally it would be a spring-loaded linkage that comes up, and this would normally attach to this lever right here. I have this apart since I have to show you something inside, so it's not connected, but normally this would control this. When the choke closes, when it's cold, it pulls this thing down, and it pulls this plate most of the way closed. So when it warms up, this choke is supposed to start opening up. It pushes up on the lever here, and this thing opens up. So that's the way it's supposed to work. So the first thing I always check for on a Quadrajet that's running too rich is I check to see if the choke has closed up for some reason. And so I would look on a warm engine. The choke should look like this. Hot or warm engine, at least, it should be open all the way up. You do not need a choke on a hot engine ever. So that's what you want to see. That means that the choke is working, or at the very least somebody has blocked this thing open so it won't close up on them because the choke's not working. Okay, so what would happen if you have a hot engine but somehow this choke is broken, or the lever has fallen off up here like this one is? It's off, it's not connected, and some other various things could happen. Somebody's been in monkeying with this choke, you know. So what would happen if this thing was to close up on a warm or a hot engine? Well, obviously, if the choke plate's closed, that means it's cutting off the airflow to it. So that means your mixture, which is simply means the mixture, the ratio of fuel to air, went drastically rich. So you don't want that. That's bad. So you always want this choke to be open on a hot engine. So if you come in here and you pull off the air cleaner and it's like closed up like that, or closed over like this, if it's all the way closed, it probably won't even hardly run. So what you can do is, if you can get the engine started, that's good. If not, it doesn't matter, but you can take your air cleaner off. If you think this thing has fallen closed for some reason, you can do a little test on it. You come in with some sort of a screwdriver. This is not ideal, but this is what I have out here. And you just carefully poke that thing open and put this screwdriver in here, and that's going to hold the choke plate far enough open that it won't cause that kind of problem. And then you go back in and start the engine. Well, if you start the engine up and it runs good, and it means your engine's not sitting there shaking and the exhaust is not spewing smoke out and it's not burning your eyes and that kind of thing, then you found your problem. That means your choke is trying to close up on you. Now, you can't, normally you would never want to run your engine with a screwdriver stuck in it, but if you were somewhere away from home and this thing just started doing this and it's sucking gas, then if you're careful and use a screwdriver that's large enough like this one, it can't be stuck, it can't be sucked down in the engine, which is almost impossible anyway, and it can't get caught in the throttle linkage somehow, keep the throttle pinned open, then you can run it like this and keep the choke open. Or you can take a piece of wire and you can figure out how this thing works here and what you have to do to tie this choke open. A lot of people have done that in a pinch. So that's the first thing I always look at on a Quadrajet that is running rich. Now, let's say you do that and that didn't fix anything. It's still just kind of loping and running bad and sucking some gas and smoking and things like that. Excuse me. Second thing you can try is you can come down and you can try to readjust your mixture screws. Quadrajets have two on the front. There's one here, and they're supposed to be, yeah, it's there. You can see it there at first, but there, up there, and right there. Now, I've made a video on this. This has got a lot of response. I'm happy to help people with that video showing how to adjust carburetor mixture screws. So you can go to that. I'll link that to this. You can try to set it. Basically what you do is you get the engine running at idle speed and you rotate these screws back and forth till you get the engine to idle the fastest with each screw. You turn it too far one way, it slows down. You turn it too far the other way, it slows down. You gotta get a happy medium and you bounce back and forth. So if you do those two things, you've checked the choke and you've checked the idle mixture and make sure the screws didn't get run out too far somehow and it's not fixing it, it's still sitting there just running bad. And especially if you have external flooding, then you're going to have to go in the carburetor and check things out. And you can't really do that on the side of the road. Sometimes you can, but it's not advisable. So what do we mean about flooding? What's flooding? Well, flooding is when the carburetor simply fills up with gas in the float bowl and it does not stop filling. When your engine runs, you have a supply line somewhere that comes up, and this is where it would screw in right here at the front of the carburetor. And you have a fuel pump that's down on the engine, which is a mechanical fuel pump. It means it runs anytime the engine runs. Alright, well that fuel pump is always running and supplying about 3 to 4 pounds per square inch of gas fuel pressure up to the carburetor. Well, this carburetor works, it sounds funny to say it this way, but the theory of operation on the float chamber of this carburetor to keep the proper amount of fuel in it is it works just like a toilet float. You know, your toilet, when you flush it, the tank has to fill back up and then it gets up to the top to the fill mark and the valve in there, the float and the valve and everything, they work, that shuts off. Alright, and normally they don't leak. Well, that's how a carburetor works. So what happens is when that system in there, which I'm about to show you here when we take the top of this carburetor off, but when that thing fails, then the fuel pump just keeps on pushing fuel in here and the level just goes up and up and up and up, and pretty soon it starts coming out places external to the carburetor. Like one of them, for instance, this is the float vent right here. This goes directly down into the float chamber inside the carburetor. It's open to the atmosphere. Now it's inside the air cleaner, so it always gets filtered air, so that's fine, but that's one place. If you ever see gas come bubbling up out of this thing, then you have a seriously flooding carburetor. Sometimes it can run out where the accelerator pump goes through right here. Sometimes it can come out down here where the throttle linkage is attached to the rods going through the carburetor down there. Now sometimes if you were to get out here and you pump the gas without starting it, now sometimes it may drip just a couple, 3 or 4 drops out right here. That's not something to be alarmed about. That's just because you got gas that's falling down on the butterflies and this is kind of migrating out. So that's not a big deal. Don't worry about that. But the third place it can usually come out is it can come out down, overflow into the primaries here, and that goes right down in the engine. So there again, if you've got all this raw gas, excess gas coming out in here going down the engine, then the thing's going to flood. The mixture is way excessively too rich. It's got too much fuel as opposed to air. So even if that's going on, if you see gas coming out here or something like that, then even popping this choke open is not really going to help it. If you get it to run at all, it's going to run like a bag of you-know-what. It's just going to lope and smoke, and you don't want to run it with it flooding gas out here anyway. That's dangerous. So let's open this carburetor up. I've got the bolts out of it. This is just my demonstration carburetor, so I'm gonna show you what you're going to do if you have a flooding issue going on and you know it's pouring gas out or something like that. You just know it's just getting way too much fuel to it. So we're going to pull this top off the carburetor. I've already removed the bolts and look at what we got in here. And as I said, this is a demonstration carburetor, so I always have it so I can open the lid here quickly. So let's take a look in here. This is our float chamber. This is just like the toilet principle that I explained to you. This is where the fuel stays in the carburetor and it stays at a predetermined level. It's called a float level. This guy in here, this is your plastic float. It's a float body here. This is what rides in the fuel, and then at the end it's got a hinge back here and a little hinge pin that sits in there like this. And back here at the back of it, right there, you can see the top of this thing. I'm going to pull this out here in just a minute, but that's where the needle and seat is. And what happens is, the way this works is when you're I have to kind of see if I can demonstrate this. When your fuel pump starts pushing fuel into the carburetor, then this thing starts, especially if you're running like at low speeds, your float bowl here starts filling up. Well, it doesn't need to be up to the top here. The carburetor, Rochester specifies the float level, and it's probably about at least about half an inch below this lip right here. So what happens is, when this thing starts filling up, then this float raises up, and it comes up and it comes up. Let me get my thing here so I can show you that. It comes up and comes up and comes up, then it comes all the way up to the top. And at the same time, back here at the back, the way this lever principle works, the other end of this, where my pick is pushing on this, is pushing down on the float toe back here, the back of it, to push the needle valve down into the needle seat to shut the flow off. So that's how that works. And then when the engine starts sucking fuel out again, when you accelerate or you're running with a wider throttle, whatever you want to call it, then this drops again, and then it starts filling back up, and then it's always doing that. This float is always working in conjunction with that needle valve to keep the fuel level where it's supposed to be, so it doesn't get too full and it doesn't run out. Now, if you have a real high performance engine, sometimes you can actually suck one of these carburetors dry. It just can't keep up, but that's a rarity. So what are we going to do if we have this thing is flooding and we want to know why? So what we're going to do is we're going to take the carburetor apart. I've already showed you how to rebuild a Quadrajet, so you have some details on that. I may make another video to show you that again. You're going to get it in here where you can get to your float chamber, and you're going to pull the float out, and then you're going to examine the needle and seat to see if there's a problem with it. So I'm going to show you here in this next little clip exactly how to do that.